I think it's really wise of all of us as members of church congregations, of believers in God, to start recognizing that God's plan is big and He has a lot of children and there are billions of people and many of them will never even hear of Jesus Christ, let alone of the church that I belong to. And so I hope we think a little bigger. I hope we widen our circle and that anyone who's willing to try to drive to Him, that we see is on our same team and not as our opposition. It's your friend Lizzy, and I am coming with a pretty personal and raw topic for you today. I'm going to talk really openly. I'm going to share some really personal stories, and this might be unlike any episode I've ever done. I've actually totally resisted talking about this topic. A few months ago, I had this thought put into my head, and I'll tell you why I've resisted this whole conversation, to start talking about prejudice against my faith. Very outside of what I like to talk about, very outside of how I like to even talk about faith. For the past, 12, 13 years now, as I've talked about faith online, it's always been done in a way that's very bridge building and very interfaith. Very rarely have I even talked about my practice as a member of the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints, or some people refer to us as Mormons. We like to be called the Church of Jesus Christ or Latter-day Saints or LDS. And it's been really specific. I don't want to build up just this community of LDS women. I feel like there's so much bigger and more important work to be done. So when this thought crossed my mind, I think I was hesitant for two reasons. The first, that I just shared, I haven't talked about it this way. It feels uncomfortable. I'd rather talk about the bridge building than I would about specific things between faiths. I think the second reason probably was stronger for me, and that's that our church doesn't really talk like this. I lived back in Connecticut in the suburbs of New York City when the Book of Mormon musical came out. And it was pretty wild, actually, to see this musical that says in its title, Book of Mormon, become such a huge hit. And it's really remained such a huge hit. I was really curious when there was all the publicity and we see this, the big billboards coming up as I would drive into New York, that it was coming to Broadway. I was curious what the LDS Church would do in response. Would they talk about how it, in a lot of cases, demeans the faith, even demeans God in some of the scenes? Would they talk about how that's not who we are? This is how the LDS Church responded. They paid for an ad in the playbill to the musical that said, "The book is always better than the movie." And I was floored. I was floored because it was genius. It was such a good opportunity to say, those who are actually interested in what this faith is, here's an opportunity to learn more. I was floored because it was such a brilliant way to link arms and show we're good-natured. We laugh at ourselves too. We don't take ourselves too seriously. I also thought it was awesome to turn the other cheek. And really, that's how the LDS Church responds to things like this. When we're mocked, when we're ridiculed, we often just say, slap me on the other one. Here it is. Here we are. And I think, honestly, as followers of Jesus Christ, that's usually the right approach. We know that this is what happens to people of faith. If you are listening as a believer in Jesus Christ, that's actually more typical of the life of disciple than to say, oh, we shouldn't face any persecution or we're ready to fight at every point. Jesus Christ himself even would stop his apostles from coming out that way when people reviled them. A lot of times we take it. So when this thought came in my mind, I just thought, that's not how we approach things. That's not the tone I want to take. I don't want to be misheard or misrepresented as being angry at other faiths. But it was odd that the thought even came, honestly. The fact that I even had that thought was a little strange to me. And so over the next month, I was just mulling over it. Is this something crazy? Did I eat something and sleep wrong? Or is this maybe a prompting? God is telling me, speak up and use my voice. And the interesting thing over that next month was that I kept having these little things put in my mind, these memories called back to me of how this prejudice has looked throughout my life. And again, when I had this thought, talk about the prejudice against those of your faith, the first thought I had really was I haven't really gone through any prejudice because I'm a member of the LDS Church. That doesn't even feel real. I identify with this fact that I've been a persecuted religious group. But then thing after thing came to mind that's happened to me, that's happened to my family, that's happened to my husband. I thought, man, maybe there is something more to it. So in today's episode, I'm going to go through what this really looks like, the bigotry, the bias, the prejudice. I'm going to then talk about why this is concerning to me. I'm not a doomsday personality. I'm not someone who says, man, this is going to look just like Nazi Germany against the Jews in World War II. Like, I don't talk like that. I know those of you who have listened to my episodes know that that's not the tone I take, and that's not actually how I feel. But I want to talk about why I'm actually concerned about this and why this matters. And then I want, for those of you, I hope, who are listening in with an honest, truth-seeking curiosity of like, yeah, why is this a problem? Who is the LDS Church? Just introduce a little bit. And I'm not even going doctrinally here. I'm just going to talk about who we are as a faith and why the things that you've heard aren't right. And then last, I just want to talk about what my hope is, what I hope comes from this episode. And that hope is actually not just for those who may have been speaking out against our faith unknowingly in some circumstances. It's also for those within our faith and what I hope our response is and how we check our own biases and prejudices ourselves. So first, just this list of things that have happened in my life. And it's funny, I think I've heard a lot like, oh, women don't have as many opportunities. And is it harder to be a girl and be in the workforce? And I have never felt that. Maybe again, I just don't identify with it. So those things don't stick out to me. It's crazy. I really haven't experienced that. I've experienced prejudice against my faith over and over. The first, I was probably 10 years old. I was living in a predominantly LDS city, and I had this friend who was awesome. I honestly can't remember what faith she was. I just remember we didn't go to the same church, but we lived really close. So we would have if she had been a member of my church. And one day she came, I can't remember if we were in school or we were playing outside in a field that was kind of close by our houses. And she just told me she couldn't ever come to my house again. And I was like, oh, why? And she mentioned that in her church, she had been shown a movie, and I don't even know what the movie was, that talked about the damaging practices of the LDS faith and really positioned us as like demons. And again, I don't know what this movie was. I know there was another movie out at the time that was shown in a lot of congregations. My guess it wasn't this, because she said it was more of a cartoon movie that talked about us as these devils. And that's pretty extreme, especially to be shown in a church, that you can't go in their homes, that you should be scared, and just really not okay to show children and for them to say you can't play with these kids. The next, there was a good chunk of time between the next time, and this was on my mission. I served a mission for the Church of Jesus Christ. I lived in Croatia. It's an interesting thing to be a missionary and to be female. You do have a companion that you walk around with, but you're all over the world. I was in Europe. I had siblings who were also in Europe and the West Indies and in Asia. And I know friends who have been all over, right? During my mission, there were missionaries who were stoned. Literally, not like they were taking drugs. They had stones thrown at them, like biblical times. I had missionaries who were beat up, who spent nights in the hospital because of physical violence. And there was a time in my mission when we were knocking on doors. And again, these are 20, I was 21 at the time. Most of our missionaries go out at 18 or 19. And you knock doors and you have some message like, I want to share a message of hope that helps your family. I want to teach you about Jesus Christ and the peace he brings to your life. I mean, that is literally what we're there to do: service and teach about Jesus Christ and baptize those who are interested to join our faith congregations. And we knocked on one guy's door. He opens the door and he's in just only his underwear, undressed, probably intoxicated. And he comes out, he actually starts to shut the door. My companion starts knocking again, which we shouldn't have done. That was on us. He opens it, proceeds to grab us both by the neck, shouts at my companion. I have no idea what he's saying because I'd only been in Croatia for a couple of weeks and had no concept of all of those words in the Croatian language for sure. And then throws us literally down the stairs. And I remember leaving the building, shaking and crying and thinking, what in the world just happened to me? And again, this is not isolated. Like, violence against Mormon missionaries happens. Not okay. The next one, it was early Small Seed Days. That was the blog I used to run. I would like to call it a Christian ministry. Some Christians didn't like that term because they said members of our faith aren't Christian, even though it's right in our name. And right in what we do every Sunday. We believe in Jesus Christ. And there was one experience where I had been doing a collaboration with a lot of accounts in our similar demographic. We were giving away t-shirts and what was it? Books, whatever, study guides, a bunch of beautiful Christian product. And I'd reached out to this awesome couple whose tagline was like living like Jesus. And they were super excited to be included in the giveaway until about a week after the collaboration started. And I get a message, and I still have the message. I won't read it verbatim, but hey, I'm just curious, are you guys actually Mormon? I was like, yeah, we prefer to be called the Church of Jesus Christ. But yeah, that's who we are. And they said, well, we've had some members of our community reach out who don't prefer that we do business with Mormons. And they pulled the collaboration, even though we had given them all this publicity and everybody else in the collaboration. The point I want to make right here, I have a list of others I'm going to keep going, is this was an awesome couple. I still have a ton of respect for them. A lot of my friends who followed that collaboration, I just checked, still follow this couple. I didn't make it public. I didn't say a thing. I took the Book of Mormon musical approach where you turn the other cheek and you stay quiet because that's what we do as members of our faith. But I thought, man, that's interesting that that's okay. In so many of these examples, they were really nice people. And it was quiet, and it was a text message sent, or it was a DM on Instagram just saying, I'm so sorry, and I'm sure you'll understand. But there was no willingness to stand up for another group of faith. Another one, this happened to my husband. There was a really awesome group that was interested in doing business. One of the partners then took this proposition to the rest of his partners to say we should invest in this fund or this deal. And the partners, again, said, not okay. We know some of them are Mormon. Again, like, this is bigotry. This is prejudice. This wouldn't work if it was like, hey, they have some Asians in their group, so we won't do it. They have some Jews in their group, so we're not going to invest in them. And a lot of these examples came from strong Christians in the South. Nothing against them. I never feel more at home than when I go visit Texas, where I just feel like, man, finally, everyone can talk about Jesus and they're fine with it. Another example, a sister who lives down in Texas went to work at a clinic helping coach women who had been pregnant or had been raped or had had a pregnancy that they weren't sure if they should keep, to help talk to them about the benefits of not aborting their child. She came in, they found out she was Mormon. She was then told she could no longer volunteer. Another friend who had some really intense things happen to her, and she went to go and speak on a podcast about this experience. And it was a really prominent couple, again, with one of the most famous TV shows at the time. Again, they find out she's Mormon. They decide that they're going to pull her episode and no longer air it. I think I'm so used to saying in the past, like, well, that's just unfortunate and it's too bad and we need to be quiet and we need to, again, turn the other cheek. But at some point, I wonder, when is enough enough? And I don't know where this prejudice necessarily comes from. In some cases, like when I was 10, it was preached from the pulpit. Should be the last place that hatred and animosity and division from other Christians is preached. Maybe it's taught in the home. A lot of it's probably misunderstanding. And some of that comes from the broader narrative that happens in media, which I want to talk about for just a second. This one is crazy to me. It's super relevant. A lot of these things have happened in the last year. The first thing is in sports. This one is crazy. There's a recent ESPN article and USA Today article that came out within the last day, actually, about another experience where a whole stadium of people is chanting F the Mormons. Now, again, like LDS Church, sometimes there's an apology, sometimes there isn't to us, and we move on. Like, I haven't seen the church make another statement back, like, this is not okay. But it's not okay. It's just not. I pulled out some of the statistics of how often this has been chanted. It happened when I was at multiple games. I've been sitting in the stands. Most recently, it happened at the University of Arizona just last Friday. And the athletic director did issue an apology and said it was unacceptable and didn't reflect the university's values, which is awesome. Like, they're speaking out, and that's not nothing, right? I'm not going to actually go through the whole list, but this has happened over and over and over again. I was actually at a game at Stanford, which in my mind, I hold this really high esteem for that university. I think when I associate feelings with Stanford, it's feelings like classy and academically strong and well-reasoned. And we sat This was in 2022 during a game with some friends, and there wasn't a huge turnout. We ended up, I don't even remember if we won or lost the game. But during halftime, the Stanford band performed a halftime skit titled Gay Chicken, featuring a mock same-sex wedding using language from our sacred temple ceremonies. Again, it's like, why is this okay? You don't mock sacred things of other religions. You just don't. Then we go into media non-sports. And this one is also, it's fascinating. This year has been a year where it's almost like open fire, right? Like we have been the target over and over and over. So recently there's a Hulu docuseries, The Secret Lives of Mormon Wives. And no commentary on these women. I don't need to make a commentary on their life and how they live and how they practice their faith. That's not my business, frankly. But what's happening showing that show and tying it to the LDS Church is it's capitalizing on stereotypes and scandal and reducing our faith community. A lot of women I've had on this podcast who are incredible and doing amazing things in their communities and their homes and in the world more broadly to a sensationalized reality show. That could have been a show just about what was happening. It's actually not really about the Mormon faith. And they've reduced my faith to a spectacle, something to be examined, sensationalized, and then dismissed. If it stopped there, I might say again, like, okay, whatever. We're sensationalizing things. We're kind of making it look like a riot and naive, very similar to the Book of Mormon musical. They don't actually know what they're doing when they go out to countries like Africa. But it's turned sinister. It's turned a lot more dangerous. And one of these examples hits home knowing what I've gone through on my mission. And that's the film Heretics, starring Hugh Grant. A-list actor, right? It tells the story of two young LDS missionaries who knock on the wrong door to be trapped and tormented. As someone who was physically attacked while serving as a missionary, I can't shake the horror of that premise. It's not okay to target sister missionaries. It's just not okay. And to do it on a series with an A-list actor, what happens when someone acts out of inspiration to that? Are you accountable for that? What happens if someone who already holds hostility sees that movie as justification? And then there's the new Netflix series, which this is actually the first time I've seen my church come out and talk about how harmful it is. And that's the Netflix series American Primeval. And this one casts Latter-day Saints as violent extremists, reinforcing a stereotype that has led to real world persecution. If you're not familiar with our faith, and again, like I'm not going to get into the nitty-gritty pieces of doctrine because I just don't think that's where you gain real ground. But our faith started out with legit persecution. In Missouri in 1838, and again, that feels like, okay, that's so long ago, it's not even relevant. But there was an actual order issued against Mormons that they had to be exterminated or driven from the state. In America, yes, it's 1838 and it's the wild, wild west, but like still, that's extreme. The crazy thing is nobody noticed that law was still on the books until the late 1970s. That's when the order actually was formally rescinded with an apology from the state. But it's just bizarre, right? Like when you put these things in context, how if you ever did that against the Catholic Church, against Christians at large, against the Jewish faith, against Muslims, we would be up in arms. Like there's just no way that this is okay. For those of you who are honestly listening in and maybe you're curious about the LDS faith, I'm going to take just a minute. And I don't know how many of those there will actually be. I'm curious to see who would listen in and have an open heart and say, like, I actually am curious. What is the LDS faith really about? Who are you? What are your families like? The crazy thing is you probably already know us. You probably already have a neighbor. We're a global church. I'm going to talk about this section kind of as the way that Jesus did. Like, by their fruits, you shall know them. Who really is the LDS Church and what are our fruits? And I wrote some of these down. I'm trying really hard to be fact-checked to make sure I'm right when I talk about these incidences, that there's no inflaming statements that I'm making on my end. I really want to come with reason and logic and say, this is who we are. And I think it's time that we close the gap on saying that they should be left out of these conversations of faith and have even worse happen. So here's the studies that are done with members of the church. And I could list 20 more of these. I'm not going to, but I think these are interesting. Members of my faith donate more volunteer hours per capita than any other religious group in America. That's a big deal. That matters. When we talk about the value of faith in society, which there's study after study that has been done, like, is religion good for society? Is it helpful in communities? Think about volunteer hours. Think about those people who are running the soup kitchens and running the schools and running the organizations that are looking out for those who are sometimes left behind. We need people who are willing to volunteer. You'll find that in Latter-day Saint communities. We contribute over $1 billion annually in humanitarian aid. Again, why are we condemning and focusing and targeting on a faith who's doing this amount of good? We also have one of the highest rates of church attendance and belief in Jesus Christ among religious denominations, among Christian denominations. And again, that's Pew Research Religious Landscape Study. You can look this up. I'm not just bringing stuff out from something our church has published. Like, these are studies that are done. Again, the highest rates of church attendance. That's crazy. You also know and respect members of my faith. There are political leaders like Mitt Romney, business leaders like Clayton Christensen. I think it's crazy that in so many regards, we love LDS athletes. We love how clean they are. We love their families. We love following their stories. But yet in athletic events, we can chant F the Mormons. These are people like Danny Ainge and Steve Young. I think it's crazy that in the Super Bowl, 2 Latter-day Saint coaches led on 2 different sides, Andy Reid and Kellen Moore. It's crazy, right? Like, we have 17 million. We're not the biggest faith out there, but we're widely represented. It's been really interesting to follow the story of Hannah Neeleman, or Ballerina Farms. She's a social media influencer, also a wildly successful entrepreneur. This was actually a really cool thing for me to see, that there was an article that came out that painted her and her husband in a derogatory light. And she spoke out against it, and she was in a really loving way, and really kind of the LDS way. What was really encouraging for me to see is that there were multiple other influencers who I've never seen say anything negative or positive, talk at all about the LDS faith, who I saw come to stand behind Hannah, and say, like, this isn't okay. You can't paint women this way of any faith. And I thought that was really encouraging and really amazing. And I think that is what we need more of. I'm going to hit on this for 2 seconds, and this might incite like more fighting than it even does help. But for those of you, again, like, honest truth seeking that somehow find this podcast and wonder, like, okay, but what do they say about, like, the LDS church as a cult? This was another thing that happened, 2 months ago. I was down visiting my sister in Texas, and she's just doing some awesome work down there, interfaith work, volunteering where she can, and really doing a great job of painting the picture of this is who we really are as members of the LDS church. And she's been working in this interfaith effort they have in their small town, where once a month they get together and they pack all this food up. I think the Saturday that we were there, they packed something like 10 million pounds of food or something. I can't remember. I will fact check that, but it was amazing. Like, this whole effort. And when I sat there, I was just like, this is what we need. You're seeing people of all faith coming together early on a Saturday morning when no one wants to wake up, packing food, and then cars just lined up as they loaded this food in the back of the cars. Well, here was my experience. And again, this isn't to be derogatory. This isn't to be inflammatory. This is just like what happens too often to LDS people. I had this awesome conversation. I was working on the potatoes line to stuff potatoes in bags, and there were 2 gentlemen there who had been carrying the heavy potato bags. I don't know, 50-pound potato bags. I got there, and I think I'm tough and I work out every day. And so I'm like, I got the potatoes. And so I'm hoisting these huge bags of potatoes on my back every time we run out of the sack that's there. And it's nothing but positive. One of the men that I was talking to, he goes on these missions to Latin America, he's all in on his faith. And the conversation was beautiful and uplifting, and we were encouraging each other. And then he just, flippantly asked the question, like, oh, so what church do you go to here in this town? And I tell him, oh, I'm a member of the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints. And his response back, like, oh, why would you be a member of a cult? Now, again, this happens all the time. This is not a one-off thing. If someone posts a picture of themselves on social media, on Instagram, with a copy of the Book of Mormon, it's like bugs to a light. You are going to have the inflammatory comments, the why are you a part of a cult? You don't know what you're doing. I want to share, as an aside in this podcast more than anything, like, what does the word cult mean Just so you can understand, the word cult has been weaponized to label unfamiliar or minority groups, often as a way to delegitimize them. Historically, a cult simply meant a system of religious worship. But in modern usage, it refers to groups that use coercion, manipulation, and isolation from society. The LDS Church, with nearly 17 million members, open worship services, and extensive charitable work, does not fit this mold. So here's some of the key characteristics of a cult. Authoritarian leadership with no questioning. My reality and the LDS reality is members are encouraged to think, pray, study, and seek personal revelation. That's probably what we're told more than anything else. Pray about it. Think about it. See where God wants to take your life. Leaders are respected, but not blindly followed. Secrecy and isolation, another part of a cult characteristic. The church is open to all, holds public worship services, and actively engages in humanitarian aid worldwide. Our temples are probably the place that are the most secret or sacred to us. This isn't an anomaly. You can't go into most religious places of worship unless you belong there. That's done out of respect. This is not even just a religious thing. There's so many places and buildings that you have to be a member. You have to uphold the rules and the rights. We also hold open houses every time we have a temple so people can walk through, ask questions, see exactly what we do and what happens there. Control over personal lives. Again, members live normal lives, work in various careers, choose their own paths. They are free to leave the church at any time. Never seen an example of coercion, and I've been a member for 41 years. Doomsday predictions and fear-based teachings. The church focuses on hope, Jesus Christ, personal growth and service, and not fear-based teachings. We've got open public service, our missionary work. We're actively, as missionaries, when I would go and teach, I would teach something and always say, like, I invite you when we're gone to pray and think about this if you believe this is true. So again, I want to see that more as an aside, not as the main focus of this. But I think it's interesting to think about the great thing that happened that day when I was packing potatoes with this gentleman was he was open, actually. And there was less of a closed mind, like he didn't want to hear it. And I asked him, like, do you know what's in the Book of Mormon? He had no idea. It's an ancient book about the time of the Bible that talks about Jesus Christ as the central climax of the whole story. No idea. I asked him, like, what even is a cult? What is your definition of a cult? Have you ever met a member of the church? Have you ever Googled about what a service looks like? Where, very much like the Catholic Church, we have a communion in the middle of our service where we think about Jesus Christ and we take the bread and the water. And again, doctrinal differences that aren't the purpose of this podcast. But for someone who's willing to throw out a very derogatory term, if you're listening to this podcast, I would love you to think about the fact that, like, why, as a believer and follower of Jesus Christ, why have I made an exception in this case? It's not okay. I want to end this podcast really by talking about why I'm concerned and what my hope is. Why I'm concerned is, again, not because I'm a doomsdayer. I'm not concerned and going to make some crazy inflammatory comments right now. But I am concerned because little things do become bigger things, and we do see this. And I am less concerned only about my own faith. I'm concerned about faith more broadly. And in law school, I studied some of these topics. And the trends are that there's more religious persecution every year. It's a real thing. And if we don't band together again as people of faith who love God, and I'm not just talking about Christians, like, bring me a Jewish friend, a Muslim friend, I would love that experience and have had them in my life. And I would stand just as much for your right to worship as I would for someone of my own faith. I wonder, what if there are bigger forces at play, bigger than us, bigger than this experience? What if this religious infighting is just the step to more? And maybe this is like, if you don't believe that there's a devil and that there's actually a movement in faith, then this is going to sound really silly probably and really crazy to you. But I think when you try to dismantle a company, an organization, a country, when there's real war and battle going on, if you can first make them fight themselves and weaken themselves, they're a much easier target. What if that's what's happening right now? I believe, as, again, a person of faith, that we're coming down to more last days. I just do. And again, if you don't believe, if you're not a person of faith at all, that can sound crazy. But what if that's what's really happening? And what if the fighting and the contention, which I believe doesn't come from Jesus, what if this is part of the ploy and we've been actors in it? Last, I want to talk about my hope. And a big part of my hope in this is just that we wake up to what's happening. And this isn't just people outside my faith. I think this is people inside our faith, that we make the comments now, that we aren't afraid to draw lines and boundaries to say, hey, this isn't okay. If you're at a school and stuff like this is happening, that you don't feel like you have to be quiet and you have to hold it in. My second hope is really a vision for my kids. I think about the changes and what's appropriate. I think in some ways we've gotten so much better in the world. I think in some ways I'm nervous. I want to paint a picture for the hope I have for my kids. And I'm actually going to use the example of something that happened with my granny. Some of you watched the episode with my granny Phyllis. She's incredible. She's one of my favorite humans. She's bright and articulate. She's 93. Interestingly, her background, she grew up in Wisconsin and grew up in the Catholic Church. My mom also grew up in the Catholic Church. And then somewhere in the 70s, if I'm right, they joined the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints. The interesting thing is my grandma moved. Her husband was actually a coach at BYU. That's what brought them to Utah. Of her 4 siblings, there were 2 brothers and 2 sisters, all raised in the Catholic Church. One became Lutheran. My grandma and grandpa became members of the LDS Church. Another became Seventh-day Adventist, and one stayed Catholic. Well, about 3 years ago, for my granny's 90th birthday, a bunch of the girl cousins all flew out to Wisconsin. And I hadn't met a lot of my cousins. And it was one of the most beautiful experiences that I've had. I think my hope and desire for interfaith work, I realized may be actually a part of who I am, because so many of these cousins and second cousins and great aunts all have different backgrounds of faith. I was curious how that was going to feel. I was curious if some of this bigotry I felt being a member of the Church of Jesus Christ would come out as we became a little closer, as the lunch went a little longer. And there was, at one point, we had visited a few different places and a few different people, and then we surprised my granny by renting this house and inviting any living relative we could find to come. And a few of my sisters had this idea, like, why don't we at the end sing Amazing Grace? Which I thought was a beautiful idea. And then I'll be honest, I was worried because I didn't know what they thought about our church. And we sat there and we met a ton of people, and they were lovely and amazing. And they felt like the missing piece of my identity and heart. Like, these are my people who think broadly, who see the world, who are of different faiths and religions. And then the time came to sing Amazing Grace. And I was so worried. I was so worried at what their reaction was going to be. And so we start singing. We were kind of like in this row in the front, and we start singing Amazing Grace. And the most beautiful thing happened. They all started singing too. And there was no line in the sand that you aren't a believer because you don't believe like me. It was nothing but how lucky we all are to be in this room and to all truly believe in Jesus Christ, and that unifies us. And that's the hope I have for my kids, both in how they view others and how they're viewed, that when they meet someone who says they're a believer in Jesus Christ, that they all of a sudden have a commonality, that someone has their back, that someone else is going to stand up for different values and beliefs than maybe someone else in their classroom or in their college or in their workplace. That's the hope I have. And I think we have a responsibility to speak out in love and in unity and in peace and in truth, to say, this is not okay, and I want to link arms. I'm going to throw in a last invitation. Well, actually 2 more. One, I want to speak to my members of my own faith for just a moment. And then the other invitation gets me more excited, which is such a pipe dream. Who knows if it could ever happen. To members of my own faith, I also want you to check your biases and how you talk about people of other faiths. Do you talk about them or yourself as having the only access to God? Do you talk about your own faith as being the only way to come to Him? I think it's really wise of all of us as members of church congregations, of believers in God, to start recognizing that God's plan is big, and He has a lot of children, and there are billions of people, and many of them will never even hear of Jesus Christ, let alone of the church that I belong to. And so I hope we think a little bigger. I hope we widen our circle and that anyone who's willing to try to drive to him, that we see is on our same team and not as our opposition. That is not our opposition. There's a real opposition to fight, and it's not that. My last invitation, and man, if somehow someone took me up on this, I would be over the moon. I've wanted to do this for a long time, and I've wanted to do this, honestly, from Small Seed days. This was my vision and hope for Small Seed. It wasn't just to strengthen the women in my own church and show them that God shows up and that he loves them and they're just as important as anyone else. And they have worth and value because they are his. My hope was to link arms with other faiths. If any of you were listening, or if this was passed on to you, or you got this episode in some random way, and I hope that happens, and you're not of this faith, and you're willing to be a part of something bigger and stand up for faith in general, I would love to create an interdenominational council of women. And if we could have someone of the Jewish faith and a Muslim faith and other Christian denominations, and I would love to have someone from the Catholic faith. Also, I see as a Christian, I think it would be amazing. I would love to have a retreat. I would love to invite you to my home. I would love to meet up somewhere on your turf and talk about what we can do to unite and change the narrative and stand up for each other. Feel free to DM me on Instagram. Probably the best place to reach me if you're in and you want to do something like this. I have a lot of LDS women that I know that would love to do the same, but I really would love to hear from someone outside of our faith. And that's my episode today. I hope that it's received in the heartfelt way that I meant it to be. That I want nothing more than to reach out and to be a part of the good that you're doing in your faith. I would love to link arms. I'd love to be a part of the causes that you're a part of. I'd love to be a part of the service and link arms in the ways that you need help with. And that's my invitation. If this episode resonated with you, I invite you to send it to someone else who you know it will resonate with too, or who you hope it will provide some value to. Thank you so much for being here. I don't take it lightly. I love this community and your open-heartedness and your searching for God and for the work that he has for you to do. And so I invite you to lean in and do that thing you felt called to do in this episode today.